Step 3 is take time to figure out what your show is. And I don't just mean like what it's about, but like what is your mission? What are the values of your show? Um, who does your show speak to? What does the growth of your show look like? What is the next episode? What are the next 10 episodes? And how are you going to use your show's story to grow your show?
Hello, Josh. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. How are you?
I am feeling amazing, super pumped. I'm super excited about our conversation. For anyone watching out there, I was introduced to Josh's amazing presentation skills and all the amazing information that he provides at Podcast Movement 2 years ago. And you were the first person that popped into my head when we wanted to do this Pod Stories kind of series here on Spreaker, where we are looking to teach other podcasters how to start podcasting, and also, talking to podcasters about their experiences, about what made them start podcasting, and to help them impart wisdom onto the new podcasters of today. So I'm super excited to get into that with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's always great to hear that any talks I give inspire any response other than eye rolling. So,
No, oh my gosh, I took notes and everything. And so I'm super excited to talk all about this. And I actually wanted to start all the way at the beginning, our Americana, which was inspired by a road trip that you took with your partner in 2015. You bought a camper van and you kind of set off to see America. You spent 6 months, 40 states, 3 provinces, Canadian provinces, right?
yes.
And I'm Canadian, so it's great that you went up and saw your neighbor in the north, and countless American towns, and you looked at their histories, and you talked to the communities, and you came back and you decided that you wanted to start a podcast and talk about this. My first question that I really wanted to ask you is, why podcasting? A lot of people would have maybe started a blog or a website to write these kinds of stories. What made you kind of feel like you needed to do a podcast about it?
It's actually an assortment of seemingly random events. I'm a big music person, so I had never really engaged with podcasts before.
Mhm.
And the one time I had, the 2 podcasts that I tried out were not for me, so I just assumed podcasts as a whole were not for me, which
Mhm.
is kind of hilariously ironic now. And so, we're going on this road trip, and pretty quickly we get tired of our music options. And so we started listening to podcasts, and Serial was really big at the time, which I think was actually the major impetus because so many people we knew were talking about it. So
Mhm.
we listened to that, and then I can't recall how it came onto my radar, but Invisibilia from NPR had just launched. And that still to this day is my favorite show, but I was just so impressed with the storytelling of it and the types of stories they were telling. Um, so we got really into podcasts, and I just thought it was the coolest medium ever. And the barrier to entry was like minimal. So fast forward, our road trip ends, we end up in New York. I'm not loving it, and I couldn't find a job because the industry I had been in previously was really niche, and most of those jobs were at the Capitol in Albany. So I was like sitting around in this place I didn't really want to be, trying to find work in an industry I didn't want to be in. And I was like, well, I have this free time. I'm going to write a book about our trip. And all the while, I'm still listening to podcasts. And just at a certain point, I was like, maybe I should try doing a podcast.
Yeah.
Which had like a certain level of like hubris and Dunning-Kruger to it because I did not know what I was getting myself into at all, but just assumed it would be easy and I'd be good at it. Um, so I was like, well, I'm not going to tell anyone I'm doing this in case it's a total flop. And I just
Mhm.
set out to start interviewing people from our favorite town we had spent time in on the road trip. And I had noticed like a surge in millennials moving from big cities back to their small towns. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I was struck by everything this tiny, fairly rural and remote town had to offer. And that became the story. Like, why are millennials fleeing the cities?
Mhm.
And how are small towns evolving in a way that, like, A, is creating space for millennials, but also giving millennials the freedom to contribute to the small town and help the small town continue to evolve and grow. And it's funny because I think a lot of people hate the word millennial. I am a geriatric millennial. I'm basically Gen X, and so I don't always love millennial culture either. And I that was definitely a part of this too. Like, are millennials hurting these small towns? So, long
Mhm.
story short, I loved the episode I ended up producing and was like, well, let's try this again. And then I kept trying it again and again, and then suddenly I had a podcast.
And well, when you started your podcast, like what was the biggest challenge when you started? Like if you can remember, I know it's been a little while, but like when you started, what it was the first thing that you did and what was one of the biggest challenges that you faced?
I um I was so inspired by Invisibilia and just NPR in general that I was like, I want to do podcasts like that. I want to do immersive narrative storytelling.
Mhm.
Not even considering for a moment that, I'm just me and I was unemployed and had no money. And this was NPR that had millions of
Yep.
dollars and a team of 40. So I was like cobbling together and cutting and editing, hours of interviews into
Mhm.
a narrative episode. And I was like, oh, this is a lot of work.
Yeah, I think podcasters don't really realize, the newbies that it's a lot of work to put together a podcast. It may not seem like it, but it really is.
Yeah, every now and again, someone will be like, what's your full-time job? And I'm like, like, what? Who has time for one of those?
But I mean, I want to get to that in terms of how long it took you to actually get a full-time or be able to make a full-time income from your podcast. But I mean, at the beginning, what were some of the things that you did to kind of start the wheels, like to get the wheels moving in terms of growing your community and your listenership? Because I'm guessing that when you launched your podcast, the biggest thing was marketing it and creating that community and getting those listeners, right? So what did you end up doing to get more people to tune in?
I have to say it was 50% strategy and 50% luck. I
Mhm.
got into podcasting at a time where independent podcasts were becoming a thing.
Mhm.
And, there weren't a ton of us like there are now, but there were enough of us that we really could band together and really support one another and create space for each other. So it like there was never an official network, but it felt like a network of independent podcasts who all got in to get the game together. And because of
Mhm.
that, we were helping each other and watching each other grow.
Mhm.
So I just was like, well, I want to know all these people just because I'm a pretty social person anyway. And again, I was living in a place I didn't want to be. So my like real life social network was very small at the time. So I was like, I want to learn from these people. And, there were groups all over Facebook at the time, like independent podcasters or podcasts we listen to. And I just got into all of them and started looking for people who were doing shows similar to mine, but also just
Mhm.
reaching out to people who did shows that I liked. And I realized like what we're doing is so unique, and the only people who know this experience are one another.
Mhm.
And I had found pretty quickly on that by creating these relationships, I was able to get my show out into the world and get more listeners. And so I decided I had two plans to grow the audience. And again, it's luck and strategy. The first was I had been sitting on this collection of letters for, I think, a decade at this point that I had
Mhm.
received between a landlord and his tenants from the 80s. And they are the craziest collection of letters you'll ever read. And they're unintentionally hilarious. and it had already had a cult following because I had like turned it into a blog, and the blog was fairly successful, especially considering it was like very late into blogging at the tail end of it. And so I was like, well, this already has an audience, and that audience is bigger than the Our Americana audience. So let's turn it into a podcast and um, scalp those those listeners and bring them over to Our Americana. And that worked very well. The other
Ah,
plan, which was more strategy, was okay, so here's this group of podcasters. We're all trying to like survive and thrive. We've all become friends. Let's create a platform where we can promote each other. And so I started what was called 2 pods a day.
okay.
And for 30 days, I would run a campaign where every day I would highlight 2 different independent podcasts across all genres.
Mhm.
And everyone involved, it was a little bit like an MLM, I guess. Everyone involved, so 60 podcasts, were
Oh, wow.
going to promote it every single day. And oh my gosh, the first 2 campaigns worked amazingly because we had 60 people who all had a following between, 30 and 3,000 listeners.
Mhm.
And so all of a sudden, almost 200,000 people
Oh,
were
wow.
hearing about all these different tiny shows. And
Mhm.
it like it helped me immensely. I've talked to a few people, Wine and Crime, were I think in our first campaign, and look at them now.
Yeah.
So I think if you were really smart about using this platform to continue to grow your audience and using the platform to make more connections, and all of a sudden all these podcasters were doing, which at the time was not a thing, feed drops for one another or giving each
Mhm.
other free promos. And that network, I owe the majority of my success to that campaign, and the relationships forged through it.
That's very interesting. I mean, if you think about today, and would do you think that your campaign would work in today's podcasting world? And would you tweak it maybe, or do have done it differently if you had launched your podcast today?
It's funny that you asked that because I was just cleaning up my computer the other day and I found all the old like logos for it, and I deleted them because I was like, I don't know that. Well, A, I don't have time to do it today, but also I was like, I don't know that it would. I think the time, it was a time and a place.
Mm, mm,
I
mm.
don't think it would be successful now, at least not under the terms that it was created under, just because the market is very saturated and there is less community because of that. At the time, we were all like in school together, and
Yeah.
now it's just like a bunch of people in a city who maybe see each other but don't really know each other.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we need to think about a little bit, just because now I think a lot of the marketing tactics, maybe you just need to look at the market, look at what's happening, and kind of adjust and see how you can play in today's podcasting market, because I'm guessing it's pretty different than how it was when you started. But I want to talk a little bit about something that you already mentioned, which is that your full-time job is your podcast, which is amazing. But I mean, let's talk about how you got there, how long it took, and what well, maybe some advice throughout that whole journey, because I would love to learn a little bit more, because I'm pretty sure that you didn't launch your podcast and then say like a day later be like, yeah, I'm done, I'm good.
No. If I can like narrow it down to a headline, it's adapt to the market that's thriving. And so our Americana still to this day is my favorite thing I've ever done.
That's amazing.
It was the most fulfilling, it was the most rewarding. It's when I go back and listen to episodes years later and I'm like still impacted by them. But there wasn't a market for it. I think that show probably topped out with 500 listeners, and I even now I'm with the success that I've had, don't know that I could do more than double it at this point
Mhm.
because there just isn't a market for that type of show. At least not for an independent producer. If I'm NPR and I already have millions of listeners, I can carve out a niche. But so I was like, well, I love podcasting. I'm making a very nominal amount of money. So in order to continue to podcast, that needs to change. And so I was like, well, true crime is doing really well. And it's, I wasn't a sellout because I had a pre-existing interest in true crime. I
Mhm.
had since I was a kid. And there was a case that I just, as a total nerd, I had been following for years and like keeping track of. And then I thought about Serial, and even I hate that I'm admitting this, but I had like a Serial spreadsheet where I was like putting data from the show and I was gonna like solve this case.
That's
And
amazing.
I just thought like, all right, I have an aptitude for storytelling, clearly.
Mhm.
And I have an interest in true crime, which is doing very well in the market right now. And there's a case that no one has covered.
Mhm.
And I think there's a way that I can do it in a way that no one's doing true crime, because while it was thriving in the market, it was also oversaturated. And so it was like, much like our Americana and the Karen and Ellen letters, it was like, if I'm going to do this, I have to do it in a way that's unique. And so for me, it was, no one's having a conversation in true crime about true crime. So it was like, all right, I'm going to tell this story of this serial killer who no one has heard of, that hasn't been covered. And it hasn't been covered because he made a deal with the FBI that they would never release his name to the media, and then died. So I was lucky there. Like, that case had not been told to death. And also, it was like, I'm going to have a conversation about, like, is true crime ethical while I'm doing this true crime podcast? And I'm
Mhm.
going to challenge the listeners. I'm going to challenge myself. And while we're telling the story of Israel Keys, we're also going to tell the story of like how telling that story impacts the case, impacts his family, impacts the victims, and impacts all of us, the listeners, and me, the host. And that had varying degrees of success. I think a lot of people at that point were not accustomed to being challenged,
Mhm.
or to thinking outside the box. No one really wants to be like, how is my consumption of media harmful? And they
Yeah.
especially don't want to have that lesson from the person who's creating the media they're consuming.
Yeah.
But all this is to say, I had carved out a niche in an oversaturated market by doing those two things. And uh, a lot of people would assume that's where the story ends, but that show didn't make money for, I think, a year and a half, even
Oh,
though,
wow.
I mean, it made, like, not
Yeah.
enough to live off of. And so I was just like, all right, there's a hit here. Like,
Mhm.
I think the first season, the show was getting about 20,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days. And
Okay.
I'd been to enough conferences where I knew like 30,000 was the key. That has changed since then. And I was like, all right, I'm just going to keep doing this because the show is growing about 10 to 15% every quarter, which means I'm almost there.
Mhm, mhm.
And I waited it out, and my partner and I had a deal where I would pursue this podcasting thing for 2 years, and if I couldn't pay the bills at that point, it would be time to go get a grown-up job. And
But were you doing this full time? Like your full
oh
time?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
because it's this show, the true crime show, and I don't know if we're allowed to cuss, so I won't, is I would say, even to this day, each episode takes about 70 hours to produce.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I was working really hard. I was working, like, 15-hour days
And you were publishing episodes every week?
every week.
Every week. So
Uh,
70 hours.
yeah,
So that's not even that's a double, like, double workload per week.
and I will say, like, I made the decision to do this show 2 years before it launched, so I had
Oh,
time
wow.
to, like, get the name out there. I went to CrimeCon, which, I don't go to anymore for reasons, but I went to CrimeCon even though I didn't have a true crime podcast, and just, like,
Mhm.
promoted the crap out of it. I made friends with as many true crime podcasters as I could. and got their support. And thankfully, a lot of them listened to Our Americana or Karen and Ellen already. So they knew who I was and they had confidence in my abilities. And so I had 2 years of like campaigning for a show before it even existed. And
Wow.
that is the smartest thing you can do if you want to have a successful podcast. Like find your niche and
Mhm.
then campaign, market before you launch. Because once you launch, you're putting in at least 40 hours each week creating the show. So you're not going to have as much time to like do social media
Marketing.
and market
There's a lot to unpack here.
it.
So let me see. First of all, I think that's crazy. And I think that one of the things that you brought up, which is super important that a lot of people need to understand, is that you need to understand where the gap in the market is. You need to understand how you can fill that gap because podcasting is an oversaturated market. It definitely is. And as a result, you need to understand where you can fit in there so that you can be popular and that you can actually, have a popular podcast. I don't think a lot of people really understand that point as much as they should. It's something that we at Spreaker always tell them, understand where you can fit, what gap there is that your podcast is going to be filling, because just because you're an amazing person that talks like has, a great energy doesn't necessarily mean that will bring in people, unless you're like Oprah or Brad Pitt or, I mean, I don't think they know they need too much. But that's amazing. And I think that it's mind-blowing as well that you spent 2 years before you launched really talking up your podcast. I mean that's huge. I don't think a lot of people also realize the amount of work that you need to do. I'm guessing to build that community, to really lay the solid foundation before you launch your podcast. So I think that's crazy.
Yeah, and if you even look, like, the community building started even before that, because I was doing
Mm,
it with Our
yeah.
Americana and the Karen and Ellen letter. So, I had, by accident, 3 years of really, like, creating a community within the industry before I launched the show.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the show would be as successful as it is today without having created those tiny shows beforehand.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people, and even with that community and that base of community and that foundation, you launch your podcast and it still took, 2 years for you to be able to actually make a decent 2 years of, you know, 40-hour work weeks or 50-hour work weeks of really focusing on this podcast before it actually made an income or a full-time income, at least, so that you could really just say like, okay, I can live off of my podcast now, which is a lot of dedication and a lot of time and a lot of effort spent. And I think that, people, it's great to hear that. It's great to see and hear the realities of it, because a lot of times people see the successes, but they don't see the work that goes behind the success. Everyone thinks, you're overnight success, but it doesn't quite work like that.
No, it requires like a very severe level of commitment and steadfastness. And I think once I got into it, it was like, I love this. I need to make it work. And
Hmm.
that drive of like, I can never go back to a 9 to 5 because this is my passion was
Hmm.
like, all right, if it means I'm not going to take a day off for a month, like, I'm not going to take a day off for a month. Or if it means like living on on the generosity of my partner for 2 years or 3 years, like, hopefully he's game for that because like this needs to work. So most people, especially now, like you need to be committed to the craft if you want it to work because it like at this point you can't part-time it
Yeah.
and find a space in this industry.
Yeah. That's great advice. I mean, can we also talk about how you went about monetizing or getting like, because I know that in the podcast movement presentation that you did talk about different ways that, created the community, that you monetize the podcast. I know you set up a Patreon, and maybe we can talk a little bit more on, how you created the community and built the community, what you used, what strategies, and then maybe how you monetized your podcast.
Yeah. So I started with Patreon because
Yeah.
there was no barrier to entry. They'll take anyone. And what I did at first before the true crime show launched was I did a Patreon for, I had 3 other baby shows, is what I call them, that I started with. And they all had one Patreon. So it was like
Okay.
funneling everyone into one space. Because that way, if someone's just a listener of Our Americana, they're going to discover Karen and Ellen letters, whether they want to
Mm,
or not.
that's smart.
And it's putting all the money in one space, and then it's giving you opportunity to cross promote and have a single RSS feed where all your baby shows exist, and whether you subscribe to playlist or not, you're going to hear the episodes.
Mhm.
And it's also, at the time, after 2 pods a day, I was incorporating as many indie true crime or as many indie podcasters as I could into those other productions. So our Americana had a special where we went to the hometowns of some podcasters, and Karen and Ellen letters, we started doing after shows where podcasters would come on and we would talk about the episodes. And then playlist was really just like bringing a different panel of podcasters on every episode to share their favorite music and talk about the stories behind it. So it was like I never stopped building a community and also being a
Mhm.
linchpin in a community because I was introducing other podcasters to each other. Um, and so all that's happening. They're out in the world having me guest on their show and talking about my shows and
Yeah.
sharing links. And again, I've mentioned them before, and they've become some of my closest friends. Wine and Crime show skyrocketed out of the gate because they also filled a niche that had not been filled yet. And they all of a sudden were this massive show, and they were talking about me and my shows because I had created this relationship, I had given them space, and I was having them on my show, so they were promoting their appearances on my show. So all this is to say, Patreon started growing as all the shows grew, and then it
Mhm.
was time to launch the true crime show. And so I created a separate Patreon for that because it was just a wildly different topic than music or comedy or heartfelt hometown stories. But I made sure to send everyone over there and said, like, if you like my narrative style, like, I am bringing that to true crime, and I'm doing a true crime show that hasn't been done before.
Mhm.
So please go listen. And they did. And that's around the time where AdvertiseCast lowered their barrier to entry. So I think at that point, you just had to have like 1,000 downloads in the first 30 days to get, and it was very small ads, but you could get very small ads. So
Yeah.
I signed up my 3 baby shows for that and started running ads. And then I signed up True Crime BS for that and started running ads. And as that show grew, I was able to book better ads at better rates. Meanwhile, I'm keeping the Patreon. I
Mhm.
started selling merch. And that's where I think the majority, or I know the majority. I feel like there were maybe a few other like tiny little revenue streams
Mhm.
coming in, but those were the big ones. And then I was never afraid to take new opportunities. I tell like now I'm in the the phase of like I say no a lot, but the first 4 years I said yes to everything.
Okay.
And so as True Crime BS got bigger, I started being poached by streaming services.
Mm.
And it was like, okay, if you will host all 4 of my shows for free and give me some sort of revenue service, whether it's your own ads, like I will come aboard. But I'm also not signing any exclusivity deals because I want to
Mhm.
keep AdvertiseCast. And so that happened. I joined Podbean, who was wonderful to me, and they got me a bunch of speaking gigs. So I started doing those. And so I was able to go to conferences for free and publicize all of the shows and meet more people and build more of a community, and learn about podcasting. And so through that, I was able to make more money, develop more revenue streams, and meet more people and get my show out into the world without having to pay anything. And then the true crime show continued to grow, and I got approached by Spreaker, and they said, we actually have dynamic ads, we have host read ads, and we will not make you sign any exclusivity deals, and we will take all 4 of your shows, and we'll give you an advertising stipend. And even though Podbean had been really great to me, I knew that I had at that point outgrown them. And so I said, like, thank you so much. Unless you can offer what they're offering me, like, I have to take care of me because this is
Mhm.
a challenging industry to make money in, and I need to go where the money is if I want to survive.
Yeah.
And they were really lovely about it. And so I went to Spreaker, and yeah, I think it's about like not being afraid to adapt or make changes because and this sounds more cutthroat than it is, but like it is hard to make a livable wage in podcasting. And so you have to say yes to every opportunity you get.
Yes, definitely. I think now, especially with this, everyone's kind of trying to create their own podcast. And it's, you've said it a couple of times, the fact that it is an oversaturated market. And so really understanding what you offer and really just say yes. And I love the fact that you really created a community not only with your listeners but with other podcasters, and that you don't have to see other podcasters necessarily as competition, even if they're in true crime as well, or if they're in the same niche as you. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to see them as competition. You can see them as allies, that you can work together to be able to help boost your both of you up. And I think it's really interesting to also think of, well, this person might not be very, very popular, but if we work together and I really want to talk to them, then maybe in the future, if they do get popular, it's not only working with podcasters that you feel like you can get something out of them. I think I kind of got that feel when you were talking about, it's just that kind of community building and really kind of wanting to help each other out. And then, they'll obviously probably return the favor if they do hit it big.
Yeah, and I always say like be authentic because
Yes.
most of us can smell a fraud from a mile away. And I always joke that like once my show started like ending up on like Vulture and like getting mass media, I suddenly had a lot of people who wanted to be my friend who I had never talked to
Mm.
before. So I think like develop relationships authentically and like know that they could lead somewhere, but don't just go up to a big show and be like, I want to be friends with you because I have something to gain from it, because
Yeah.
it just makes you look really bad.
Definitely. And I think that, you know, eh, I think that's really important. The authenticity, the fact that, podcasting is really it's a community. I think that it's a community of individuals, it's a community of like-minded people, and creating that community and reaching out to other podcasters and really creating that and developing that and nurturing that is only going to help you. And I think that a lot of people might not take the time, but they should, and they should put in the effort to be able to strengthen their own community of podcasters, and not only just focus on listeners, but it's also fellow podcasters, which I think a lot of people might overlook when they're trying to build their shows.
In my case, the listeners would not be there were it not for the other podcasters. So I think
There you go.
when you're starting, like that's going to be your priority, is like building authentic, real relationships. Because your friend Sam at the deli can probably get 5 people to listen to your show, but Generation Y can probably get 5,000 people to listen to your show.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, I think that it's just, even if you started your podcast back then, I think a lot of this can still be implemented today, even in today's market and today's podcasting. The sea of podcasts out there, authenticity, the fact that you need to be really passionate about what you're saying and what you're doing, because it does take a long time. It's a lot of effort, a lot of work to get to making a good amount of money off of your podcast. So if you don't like what you're talking about, you're not going to make it in the end. Um,
Well, and then and the flip side of that, which is so important, is when you do start making money to make sure you pay it forward or give back. So I like the show is big, and I say that with a level of like humility and fear. Um, uh, but it was like, okay, like I did not get here on my own. I got here because of this community. And so my job now is to help
Mhm.
the smaller shows who were in my shoes, um, to help elevate them like the bigger shows helped me. And then also, like, yeah, I'm making money, but I work in true crime. And so it's my responsibility to pay that money back. And
Mhm.
so it's finding causes, supporting. I work with 1 to 2 different non-for-profits every season of my show and funnel a ton of money into those because A, it's just kind of gross to, like, make money off of true crime and not,
Mhm.
give back, but also B, like, again, it goes back to who helped you get to where you are and make sure that you do what you can to pay it back, whether that's literal or figurative.
Yeah, 100%. Now, if you were going to do all of this whole journey over again, is there anything that you would do differently?
Um, I mean, little tiny things.
Okay.
I would have been a little more strategic with, like, my URL or, in June of last year when the world was exploding, I would have stayed off Twitter. But other than that, no, I think and again, like, I wanna go back, I didn't know what I was doing, I was just kind of, like, being myself,
Mhm.
but what I did in the beginning out of just, like, having a desire for friendships within this community, and seeing like, okay, I love this show, but this show isn't going to be a hit, so let me
Yeah.
pivot. Those things really set me up for the success that I have today.
I love how with our Americana, you kind of, you have to also realize when something is not working and understand that even though it's something that you might love and you think this is amazing and it's my passion and I love it, at the end of the day, it's all about your listeners, right? It's about what people want to listen to. And if they're not wanting to listen to that, unfortunately, sometimes you just need to kind of let it go. And it can be hard. But I think that it's really amazing that, you have that experience where you said and you understood this isn't happening. I need to pivot.
I had to have a really honest and tough conversation with myself, which is like, I love this show. Is this the best that I can do with this show?
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, then that means it's time to find a new show. And it was. It was like, I cannot make this show any better. So it's time to move on.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a super important question that people need to ask themselves sometimes. You can be doing a show that you love for a year, 2 years, and you need to have like like you had the end point, right? You're in it for 2 years. You put in what you need to, and your sweat, blood, tears, everything into it. And if it's not working, then it's not working, and that's nothing bad against you, but maybe it doesn't hit home with the listeners. In terms in terms of marketing, though, like. Would you have done anything different in terms of marketing strategies or uh, yeah, let's go with the marketing strategies.
Yeah, it's like, I guess for better or worse, it all comes back to community for me. Like
Yeah.
the community was both my market research and my advertising. I think I spent money that I shouldn't have on, like, Facebook ads, and I didn't see at that point, and again,
Okay.
the industry has changed a lot in 5 years, but I didn't see a return on that. The biggest return I saw was making friends with other shows and cross-promoting,
Okay.
and then going to relevant conferences and conventions and just talking to people and getting my name out there, but, if I could say, like, "Here are 3 marketing channels that made my show successful. It was my friendships with Wine and Crime, my friendships with Generation Y, and my friendships with Crime Lines." Like,
There you go. But I mean, I think it also depends. I mean, if you're starting with no community, building a community from scratch is very, very hard. And if you can rely on other people's communities, um, then you kind of already have a head start because you already have a base of individuals from the other podcaster that you can kind of lure into your listenership.
Yeah, but also, like, don't be a door-to-door salesman. I see a lot of
Authentic.
people, like, go into a very successful show's page and be like, "Here's my show." Like,
Oh, no.
no. Like,
That's not how you make relationships.
no, like, let that show promote you. It's not your job to, like, go into their space and try to hold court.
Mhm.
Again, it goes back to, like, the authenticity. Because if you do
Yeah.
that, like, not only are their listeners gonna be like, "Who's this clown?" But they're gonna be like, "Who's this clown?" So, yeah, again, like, create authentic relationships and, um, w if they're real and if they're true, then, like, ask for favors because those of us who have grown up in this industry know how hard it is and know that community got us to where we are, and we are happy to help if we feel like, again, the relationship is true and authentic.
Yes, and, like, building real relationships also takes time. It's not something that, someone will email you, Josh, and say, "Hey, how are you? I have this podcast, can we connect or can you promote me?" It doesn't work like that. I mean, how would it work? For example, you're already kind of a big kind of a podcaster. Uh, if a podcaster wanted to reach out, for example, and build that authentic relationship, like how would that look like? How would you want that to look like?
I think now, I think just being like painfully honest.
Okay.
I think it's happened once. I get a lot of like, "Here, will you play my ad?" And I delete those emails. But someone did reach out and they were like, I listened to your show, I love it, and then, like, they were able to, like, say a few things that made me believe them, and then they were like, "I am doing a true crime show, and here's, like, some similarities between your show and my show, and why your audience might be interested in my show, and why my audience might be interested in your show, and I'm struggling to break into the market. I really love this. Will you listen to my show, and let me know what you think?" And I listened to her show, and I thought it was great. I
Okay.
did see crossover in our 2 audience, like, who our audience would be, and I thought, "Oh my gosh, this is a show I wanna, like, get behind, um,
Okay.
and support." And so I did. I think at the time, I may be remembering this wrong. I might have charged her, like, a very nominal fee, but I
Right.
ran, an ad for her. No, I ran an ad for free, and then later on, I did a, feed drop for her for, like, 10% of what I normally would have charged, and then I also, like, have a relationship with her now. I'm going to the town that she lives in next week and having a meet and greet, and I was like, "You should come, and we should promote your show at the meet and greet,"
That's
and I
amazing.
mention it on social media all the time, so I think it's like you don't have to all of a sudden become best friends with me. I think if you're just really honest and like, what's in it for me? Like, if you want my help, what's in it for me? And,
Yes.
not to like sound curt, but it is like I get 70 emails a day. So like, give me an email that's going to be worth my time. And I think she was really smart about saying like, here's proof that I listened to your show. Here's proof
Mhm.
that like your show and my show have things in common, and there is an audience crossover here, and this can be beneficial for both of us.
I think that's great. I think that's a really great example because a lot of the times people don't even listen to the shows. They shoot out emails. They might get the name wrong. They might not even put the name in in the email at all. And it's so inauthentic and people can see right through that. If you don't take the time to actually listen to their show, understand what because yes, there you need to get something out of it as well, right? You can't just promote something that your listeners are not even interested in or they would never be interested in, like it doesn't make sense. So it's also understanding what the podcaster can gain from it from and developing that. And I think that's a really great example.
And I think,
Uh
like,
yeah,
I'm from a marketing background, so this comes natural to me, but I think, like, figure out who your audience is. Like,
yeah,
before you reach out to anyone and be like, "This is what my show is. Who's my listener?" And
yeah.
then once you know who your listener is, you'll be well equipped to reach out to other people and market your show.
Yes, we talk a lot about that in on Spreaker on the blog. We always talk about how you really need to understand who are your listeners because even if you want to monetize your show in the future, uh, you're looking for advertisers. Well, who is listening to your show? The advertisers need to understand if they should put in ads into your podcast, because who are the people that are listening? Are they in their demographic, their target audience? And if you don't know who's listening to your show, then it's going to be really hard for you to monetize your show in the end as well, or sell your show, do anything with your show, because you're just kind of talking into, the abyss, just everywhere, and it just doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask one final question
Okay.
before we wrap up. And I think you've already mentioned it multiple times through this whole conversation, but we're just gonna end with this one. What kind of advice would you give podcasters, newbie podcasters that are just starting out today? What kind of advice would you give them?
I would say like 3 steps. Step 1 is make several episodes, like produce and complete several episodes before you release your first episode, because it's going to take longer than you think it takes, and you want to be ready to hit the ground running. Step 2 is start making relationships before you launch your show. And then step 3 is take time to figure out what your show is. And I don't just mean like what it's about, but like, what is your mission? What are the values of your show? Who does your show speak to? What does the growth of your show look like? What is the next episode? What are the next 10 episodes? And how are you going to use your show's story to grow your show?
Those are really great tips. Branding 101, right?
Yeah.
In terms of in terms of really understanding the foundations of your show, so that you can launch it and you can grow and you can eventually, if you want, monetize your podcast as well. Thank you so much, Josh. I think I've learned a lot of things. I'm sure that everyone who is watching has learned a lot as well. Now, I will link all of this in the description, but maybe you can tell everyone watching a little bit more about where people can find you, if they want to reach out and talk to you or ask you a question. Where would that be?
Yeah, so if you go to truecrimebullshit.com, there's a contact tab, and it gives you lots of different reasons to contact me, and on there is collaborations. So you can go there, and all my shows are on that webpage. And yeah, that's the best way. It's funny, the listeners will ask me questions every day, and I'm like, go to the website. Everything is on the website. Just go there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again. And it was really great speaking to you.
Likewise. Thanks, Yvonne.